So in 2021, I found myself in the middle of a global campaign centered on carbon credits. The idea that organizations can offset their carbon emissions by investing in carbon sequestration projects, a process that essentially removes carbon from the environment. As I delved into interviews with Fortune 500 companies, they talked about the benefits of carbon credits, like their ability to verify carbon emissions and create trails of investment. But as I dug deeper, I very quickly realized that these carbon projects are a short-term solution for a long-term problem. In fact, they're only viable for about a decade. What's more, these organizations admitted to me that they knew they needed to radically transform their business model into something more sustainable, but they often prioritized short-term gains and profit over planet. And this dichotomy is indicative of a much larger problem. 100 organizations are responsible for over 70% of emissions in the world since 1988. As an example, the fossil fuel industry has known about climate change since 1977, and they hid it from us. What's more, organizations continue to break their promises about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So what do we do about it? How do we hold these organizations accountable? Over the last few years, we've seen more calls for transparency and accountability when it comes to climate change. As a society, we expect our businesses to behave ethically, or at the very least, not cause undue harm to us or the planet. And so when this does happen, we tend to expect accountability or greater insight from organizations, from leadership, and from government. There's a presumed logic that the way to get accountability is through transparency, but it doesn't work like that. I've been studying the issue of transparency for the last 6 years as both a practitioner and a researcher. My work centers on environmental social governance, where I'm interested in issues around corporate responsibility, international regulatory frameworks, and activist engagement. At the end of the day, I'm interested in answering the question, how do we make organizations responsible for their role in developing a sustainable world? And the answer that I so often get is accountability and transparency. But we have to understand what that means. We tend to think about transparency from an information transmission model, where me, the sender, sends you, the receiver, a message. And there's all of these articles that tout the benefits of transparency in corporate sustainability. It increases an organization's reputation, it helps increase stakeholder engagement and trust, and yes, it helps with economic profit. But what if, instead of thinking about transparency in these transmission model terms, we thought about it as something that's relational? We would quickly come to find that transparency is much more complex than we give it credit for. It's as likely to reveal information as it is to conceal it, as likely to clarify as it is to confuse. Transparency is not just about information and data. In the world of sustainability, we have this problem called the promise-performance gap. It's this idea that organizations oversell on their promise of sustainability, but they underperform on the actual doing of it. And when we analyze the transparency of these organizations, we all too often find instances of misinformation, ambiguity, and greenwashing. That is, organizations deceptively portray themselves and their practices as being environmentally friendly, when in actuality they're not. And this reinvigorates calls for transparency and accountability all over again. What's more, technology has made transparency more accessible than ever before. Organizations and individuals create trails of data that can be collected, analyzed, and shared. And in many ways, this has made organizations more open. But it's also made them more closed. They're likely to hide, conceal, or opacify their information, often in plain sight. As an example from my own work, I did a study with colleagues from the University of Texas as part of a grant for MISTRA, the Swedish Center for Environmental Research. And we interviewed compact directors from the United Nations Global Compact, the largest consortium of corporations and other organizations devoted to sustainability in the world. And these compact directors talked to us about the constraints that these individuals often have when writing environmental reports. They have to deal with government regulation, they're beholden to shareholder expectations, and they're often trying to mitigate any perceived risks from their competitors. And suddenly, this one document becomes a negotiating ground for all of these different transparency demands and expectations. What's more, people from the UNGC are not reading these reports. In part, that's because there's just too many of them, but that also means that organizations are probably misrepresenting or potentially even greenwashing the information. And this is why transparency is so important, and why it's important for us to understand the relationships within environmental and social governance. If we want to create effective policy, we have to be able to understand the relationships, the mechanisms, and the technologies that govern this sustainability infrastructure. As part of my work, I also look at the digital technologies and platforms that organizations use to communicate about sustainability. They're essentially using a kind of network of networks to communicate and bombard us with sustainability information. Case in point, last year I was in Sweden, and when I got off my flight in Stockholm, in the middle of the airport, there was this massive billboard touting an organization's sustainability. That night, when I was watching TV in my hotel room, there were commercials from the same organization talking about sustainability. And the next day, when I was checking my social media, there were Instagram ads from the same organization talking about sustainability. I didn't follow this organization. So if these organizations can essentially stalk us, then can we do the same thing? Can we monitor their actual sustainability activities through these integrated technologies? And the answer is yes. It's through something called infrastructures of traceability, which are essentially a personal map that show us everywhere a good, a product, or a service has been, and everyone who's come into contact with it. As part of my own work, I've looked at IKEA's forestry management practices. And IKEA has over 50 suppliers worldwide for timber, where they use a series of 3 different networks to monitor these suppliers. The first is a paper trail that's supplied by these suppliers that auditors use. The second is a series of blockchain data points that show us where the timber was originating from and follows it all the way through its end-of-use cycle. And the third is the use of wood pulp DNA that can help verify the timber's origin to which forest. And these 3 together create an integrated network that's an infrastructure of traceability for IKEA's forestry management. These integrated networks and technologies, like blockchain, have incredible promise for transparency and accountability. Blockchain is essentially a digital record-keeping system, where each block represents a transaction or some sort of other digital data that's then verified and added to the chain. It's virtually hack-proof, it streamlines the verification process, and when it comes to transparency and accountability, it follows that good, that product, or that service all the way through its end-of-use cycle. But it also has several issues. The first challenge is scalability. Currently, the technology cannot handle these large-scale transactions that we need it to. And during the verification process, there's so much energy consumption that it's really not viable for environmental conservation, which is, of course, the kind of whole point. The second issue is something called the black box problem. So this is the idea that although blockchain is about transparency, it's often really difficult for us to understand the algorithms and the decision-making processes for it. And this makes it incredibly difficult to regulate, right? We as a society tend to react to technology rather than proactively thinking about the uses, the functions, and the potential repercussions. So how do we manage transparency and sustainability in this information-dense age? Well, by taking a step back and thinking about transparency in these relational terms, we very quickly see that organizations impact and are impacted by information disclosure. It's clear that we can't trust organizations to be transparent about their sustainability impacts. There's always the potential for greenwashing. On the other hand, it's not feasible for government to pour all of this resource and manpower into auditing these organizations. Instead, by using these integrated technologies like blockchain, we can essentially safeguard both organization and government, right? So an example of this would be something called a smart contract, which automates the monitoring system of looking at an organization's carbon emission and then automatically sends that data to a third-party auditor who makes it available for the public. How do we do that? Well, first, we have to demand clear and verifiable data from organizations. Government and third-party verifiers have to be able to ensure meaningful and comprehensive data rather than relying on these narrative metrics like we do currently. Second, we have to embrace the responsible use of these technologies, working with organizations to develop tech that actually benefits both the environment and society. And third, we have to develop regulatory frameworks that essentially help us govern these transparency technologies, ensuring data accuracy, the verification process, and help with privacy protection for things like consumer data. Now, more than ever, it is imperative that we hold these organizations accountable. So for those in the audience, and for those who might listen to this message later online, I'm asking you to demand more from the organizations that you buy from, that you invest in, and that you engage with. Expect from them clear and verifiable data about their social and their environmental impact. And collectively, we need to be lobbying our legislators for robust and comprehensive legislation around transparency and transparency technologies that ensure both data accuracy and privacy protections. We are at a crossroads in what our future could look like. On the one end, there is the edge of human extinction. And on the other is a robust, healing, and thriving planet. And right now, we are somewhere in the middle, where these large corporations have been able to future-proof their supply chains and their national borders. But that leaves the most vulnerable communities out in the cold, fending for themselves. We can change this trajectory by embracing these new technologies and demanding transparency regulation that ends the misinformation and the greenwashing campaigns. By shining a light in the dark places, we can lay the groundwork for a sustainable future. Thank you.